The Man in Lower 10, Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 24. His Wife's Father. I jumped up and seized the fire tongs. The cat's wail had roused Hotchkiss, who was wide awake at once. He took in my offensive attitude, the tongs, the direction of my gaze, and needed nothing more. As he picked up the candle and darted out into the hall, I followed him. He made directly for the staircase, and part way up he turned off to the right through a small door. We were on the gallery itself. Below us the fire gleamed cheerfully. The cat was not in sight. There was no sign of my ghostly visitant. But as we stood there, the Bokhara rug, without warning, slid over the railing and fell to the floor below. "Man or woman?" Hotchkiss inquired in his most professional tone. "Neither. That is, I don't know. I didn't notice anything but the eyes," I muttered. "They were looking a hole in me. If you'd seen that cat, you would realize my state of mind. That was a traditional graveyard yowl." "I don't think you saw anything at all," he lied cheerfully. "You dozed off, and the rest is the natural result of a meal on a buffet car." Nevertheless, he examined the Bokhara carefully when we went down, and when I finally went to sleep, he was reading the only book in sight, Elwell on Bridge. The first rays of daylight were coming mistily into the room when he roused me. He had his finger on his lips, and he whispered sibilantly while I tried to draw on my distorted boots. "I think we have him," he said triumphantly. "I've been looking around some, and I can tell you this much. Just before we came in through the window last night, another man came. Only he did not drop as you did. He swung over to the stair railing and then down. The rail is scratched. He was long enough ahead of us to go into the dining room and get a decanter out of the sideboard. He poured out the liquor into a glass, left the decanter there, and took the whiskey into the library across the hall. Then he broke into a desk, using a paper knife for a jimmy. "Good Lord, Hotchkiss," I exclaimed. "Why, it may have been Sullivan himself. Confound your theories. He's getting farther away every minute." "It was Sullivan," Hotchkiss returned imperturbably, "and he has not gone. His boots are by the library fire." "He probably had a dozen pairs where he could get them," I scoffed. "And while you and I sat and slept, the very man we want to get our hands on leered at us over that railing." "Softly, softly, my friend," Hotchkiss said, as I stamped into my other shoe. "I did not say he was gone. Don't jump at conclusions. It is fatal to reasoning. As a matter of fact, he didn't relish a night on the mountains any more than we did. After he had unintentionally frightened you almost into paralysis, what would my gentleman naturally do? Go out in the storm again? Not if I know the Alice sit by the fire type." He went upstairs, well up near the roof, locked himself in, and went to bed. "And he is there now?" "He is there now." We had no weapons. I am aware that the traditional hero is always armed, and that Hotchkiss, as the low comedian, should have had a revolver that missed fire. As a fact, we had nothing of the sort. Hotchkiss carried the fire tongs, but my sense of humor was too strong for me. I declined the poker. "All we want is a little peaceable conversation with him," I demurred. "We can't brain him first and converse with him afterward. And anyhow, while I can't put my finger on the place, I think your theory is weak. If he wouldn't run 100 miles through fire and water to get away from us, then he is not the man we want." Hotchkiss, however, was certain. He had found the room and listened outside the door to the sleeper's heavy breathing, and so we climbed past luxurious suites, revealed in the deepening daylight, past long vistas of hall and boudoir. And we were both badly winded when we got there. It was a tower room, reached by narrow stairs, and well above the roof level. Hotchkiss was glowing. "It is partly good luck, but not all," he panted in a whisper. "If we had persisted in the search last night, he would have taken alarm and fled. Now we have him. Are you ready?" He gave a mighty rap at the door with the fire tongs and stood expectant. Certainly he was right. Someone moved within. "Hello, hello there," Hotchkiss bawled. "You might as well come out. We won't hurt you if you'll come peaceably." "Tell him we represent the law," I prompted. "That's the customary thing, you know." But at that moment, a bullet came squarely through the door and flattened itself with a sharp pust against the wall of the tower staircase. We ducked unanimously, dropped back out of range, and Hotchkiss retaliated with a spirited bang at the door with the tongs. This brought another bullet. It was a ridiculous situation. Under the circumstances, no doubt, we should have retired, at least until we had armed ourselves, but Hotchkiss had no end of fighting spirit, and as for me, my blood was up. "Break the lock," I suggested, and Hotchkiss, standing at the side, out of range, retaliated for every bullet by a smashing blow with the tongs. The shots ceased after a half-dozen, and the door was giving slowly. One of us on each side of the door, we were ready for almost any kind of desperate resistance. As it swung open, Hotchkiss poised the tongs. I stood, bent forward, my arm drawn back for a blow. Nothing happened. There was not a sound. Finally, at the risk of losing an eye, which I justly value, I peered around and into the room. There was no desperado there, only a fresh-faced, trembling-lipped servant, sitting on the edge of her bed, with a quilt around her shoulders and the empty revolver at her feet. Illustration. We were victorious, but no conquered army ever beat such a retreat as ours down the tower stairs and into the refuge of the living room. There, with the door closed, sprawled on the divan, I went from one spasm of mirth into another, becoming sane at intervals, and suffering relapse again every time I saw Hotchkiss's disgruntled countenance. He was pacing the room, the tongs still in his hand, his mouth pursed with irritation. Finally, he stopped in front of me and compelled my attention. "When you have finished cackling," he said with dignity, "I wish to justify my position. Do you think the young woman upstairs put a pair of number 8 boots to dry in the library last night? Do you think she poured the whiskey out of that decanter?" "They have been known to do it," I put in, but his eye silenced me. "Moreover, if she had been the person who peered at you over the gallery railing last night, don't you suppose, with her, belligerent disposition, she could have filled you as full of lead as a window weight?" "I do," I assented. "It wasn't Alice sit by the fire, I grant you that. Then who was it?" Hotchkiss felt certain that it had been Sullivan, but I was not so sure. Why would he have crawled like a thief into his own house? If he had crossed the park, as seemed probable, when we did, he had not made any attempt to use the knocker. I gave it up finally and made an effort to conciliate the young woman in the tower. We had heard no sound since our spectacular entrance into her room. I was distinctly uncomfortable as, alone this time, I climbed to the tower staircase. Reasoning from before, she would probably throw a chair at me. I stopped at the foot of the staircase and called. "Hello up there," I said, in as debonair a manner as I could summon. "Good morning. We gatus bi Enon?" No reply. "Bonjour, mademoiselle," I tried again. This time there was a movement of some sort from above, but nothing fell on me. We want to apologize for rousing you so, unexpectedly this morning," I went on. "The fact is, we wanted to talk to you, and you are hard to waken. We are travelers, lost in your mountains, and we crave a breakfast and an audience." She came to the door then. I could feel that she was investigating the top of my head from above. "Is Mr. Sullivan with you?" she asked. It was the first word from her, and she was not sure of her voice. "No, we are alone. If you will come down and look at us, you will find us two perfectly harmless people whose horse, curses on him, departed without leave last night and left us at your gate." She relaxed somewhat then and came down a step or two. "I was afraid I'd killed somebody," she said. The housekeeper left yesterday, and the other maids went with her. When she saw that I was comparatively young and lacked the earmarks of the highwayman, she was greatly relieved. She was inclined to fight shy of Hotchkiss, however, for some reason. She gave us a breakfast of a sort, for there was little in the house, and afterward we telephoned to the town for a vehicle. While Hotchkiss examined scratches and replaced the Bokhara rug, I engaged Jenny in conversation. "Can you tell me," I asked, "who is managing the estate since Mrs. Curtis was killed?" "No one," she returned shortly. "Has any member of the family been here since the accident?" "No, sir. There was only the two, and some think Mr. Sullivan was killed as well as his sister." "You don't?" "No," with conviction. "Why?" She wheeled on me with quick suspicion. "Are you a detective?" she demanded. "No." "You told him to say you represented the law." "I am a lawyer. Some of them misrepresent the law, but I—" She broke in impatiently. "A sheriff's officer?" "No. Look here, Jenny. I am all that I should be. You'll have to believe that. And I'm in a bad position through no fault of my own. I want you to answer some questions. If you will help me, I will do what I can for you. Do you live near here?" Her chin quivered. It was the first sign of weakness she had shown. "My home is in Pittsburgh," she said, "and I haven't enough money to get there. They hadn't paid any wages for 2 months. They didn't pay anybody." "Very well," I returned. "I'll send you back to Pittsburgh, Pullman included, if you will tell me some things I want to know." She agreed eagerly. Outside the window, Hotchkiss was bending over, examining footprints in the drive. "Now," I began, "there has been a Miss West staying here?" "Yes." "Mr. Sullivan was attentive to her?" "Yes. She was the granddaughter of a wealthy man in Pittsburgh. My aunt has been in his family for 20 years. Mrs. Curtis wanted her brother to marry Miss West." "Do you think he did marry her?" I could not keep the excitement out of my voice. "No. There were reasons—" She stopped abruptly. "Do you know anything of the family? Were they New Yorkers?" "They came from somewhere in the South. I've heard Mrs. Curtis say her mother was a Cuban. I don't know much about them, but Mr. Sullivan had a wicked temper, though he didn't look it. Folks say big, light-haired people are easy-going, but I don't believe it, sir." "How long was Miss West here?" 2 weeks. I hesitated about further questioning. Critical as my position was, I could not pry deeper into Alison West's affairs. If she had got into the hands of adventurers, as Sullivan and his sister appeared to have been, she was safely away from them again. But something of the situation in the car Ontario was forming itself in my mind. The incident at the farmhouse lacked only motive to be complete. Was Sullivan, after all, a rascal or a criminal? Was the murderer Sullivan or Mrs. Conway? The lady or the tiger again? Jenny was speaking. "I hope Miss West was not hurt?" she asked. "We liked her, all of us. She was not like Mrs. Curtis." I wanted to say that she was not like anybody in the world. Instead, "She escaped with some bruises," I said. She glanced at my arm. "You were on the train?" "Yes." She waited for more questions, but none coming, she went to the door. Then she closed it softly and came back. "Mrs. Curtis is dead?" "You are sure of it?" she asked. "She was killed instantly, I believe. The body was not recovered, but I have reasons for believing that Mr. Sullivan is living." "I knew it," she said. I think he was here the night before last. That is why I went to the tower room. I believe he would kill me if he could." As nearly as her round and comely face could express it, Jenny's expression was tragic at that moment. I made a quick resolution and acted on it at once. "You are not entirely frank with me, Jenny," I protested, "and I am going to tell you more than I have. We are talking at cross purposes. I was on the wrecked train, in the same car with Mrs. Curtis, Miss West, and Mr. Sullivan. During the night, there was a crime committed in that car, and Mr. Sullivan disappeared. but he left behind him a chain of circumstantial evidence that involved me completely, so that I may, at any time, be arrested. Apparently she did not comprehend for a moment. Then, as if the meaning of my words had just dawned on her, she looked up and gasped. "You mean Mr. Sullivan committed the crime himself?" "I think he did." "What was it?" "It was murder," I said deliberately. Her hands clenched involuntarily, and she shrank back. "A woman?" She could scarcely form her words. "No, a man? A Mr. Simon Harrington of Pittsburgh." Her effort to retain her self-control was pitiful. Then she broke down and cried, her head on the back of a tall chair. "It was my fault," she said wretchedly. "My fault. I should not have sent them the word." After a few minutes, she grew quiet. She seemed to hesitate over something and finally determined to say it. "You will understand better, sir, when I say that I was raised in the Harrington family. Mr. Harrington was Mr. Sullivan's wife's father." Chapter 25. At the station. So it had been the tiger, not the lady. Well, I had held to that theory all through. Jenny suddenly became a valuable person. If necessary, she could prove the connection between Sullivan and the murdered man and show a motive for the crime. I was triumphant when Hotchkiss came in. When the girl had produced a photograph of Mrs. Sullivan and I had recognized the bronze-haired girl of the train, we were both well satisfied, which goes to prove the ephemeral nature of most human contentments. Jenny either had nothing more to say or feared she had said too much. She was evidently uneasy before Hotchkiss. I told her that Mrs. Sullivan was recovering in a Baltimore hospital, but she already knew it from some source and merely nodded. She made a few preparations for leaving, while Hotchkiss and I compared notes, and then, with the cat in her arms, she climbed into the trap from the town. I sat with her, and on the way down she told me a little, not much. "If you see Mrs. Sullivan," she advised, "and she is conscious, she probably thinks that both her husband and her father were killed in the wreck. She will be in a bad way, sir." "You mean that she still cares about her husband?" The cat crawled over onto my knee and rubbed its head against my hand invitingly. Jenny stared at the undulating line of the mountain crests, a colossal sun against a blue ocean of sky. "Yes, she cares," she said softly. "Women are made like that. They say they are cats, but Peter there in your lap wouldn't come back and lick your hand if you kicked him. If you have to tell her the truth, be as gentle as you can, sir. She has been good to me. That's why I have played the spy here all summer. It's a thankless thing, spying on people." "It is that," I agreed soberly. Hotchkiss and I arrived in Washington late that evening, and rather than arouse the household, I went to the club. I was at the office early the next morning and admitted myself. McKnight rarely appeared before 10:30, and our modest office force some time after 9. I looked over my previous day's mail and waited, with such patience as I possessed, for McKnight. In the interval, I called up Mrs. Clopton and announced that I would dine at home that night. What my household subsists on during my numerous absences, I have never discovered. Tea, probably, and crackers. Diligent search, when I have made a midnight arrival, never reveals anything more substantial. Possibly I imagine it, but the announcement that I'm about to make a journey always seems to create a general atmosphere of depression throughout the house, as though Euphemia and Eliza and Thomas the stableman were already subsisting, in imagination, on Mrs. Clopton's meagre fare. So I called her up and announced my arrival. There was something unusual in her tone, as though her throat was tense with indignation. Always shrill, her elderly voice rasped my ear painfully through the receiver. "I have changed the butcher, Mr. Lawrence," she announced portentously. "The last roast was a pound short, and his mutton chops, any self-respecting sheep, would refuse to acknowledge them." As I said before, I can always tell from the voice in which Mrs. Clopton conveys the most indifferent matters if something of real significance has occurred. Also, through long habit, I have learned how quickest to bring her to the point. "You are pessimistic this morning," I returned. "What's the matter, Mrs. Clopton? You haven't used that tone since Euphemia baked a pie for the iceman. What is it now? Somebody poisoned the dog?" She cleared her throat. "The house has been broken into, Mr. Lawrence," she said. "I have lived in the best families, and never have I stood by and seen what I saw yesterday. Every bureau drawer opened, and my most sacred belongings," she choked. "Did you notify the police?" I asked sharply. "Police!" she sniffed. "Police! It was the police that did it. 2 detectives with a search warrant. I wouldn't dare tell you over the telephone what one of them said when he found the whiskey and rock candy for my cough." "Did they take anything?" I demanded, every nerve on edge. "They took the cough medicine," she returned indignantly, "and they said, 'Confound the cough medicine!'" I was frantic. "Did they take anything else? Were they in my dressing room?" "Yes. I threatened to sue them, and I told them what you would do when you came back, but they wouldn't listen. They took away that black sealskin bag you brought home from Pittsburgh with you." I knew then that my hours of freedom were numbered. To have found Sullivan, and then, in support of my case against him, to have produced the bag, minus the bit of chain, had been my intention. But the police had the bag, and beyond knowing something of Sullivan's history, I was practically no nearer his discovery than before. Hotchkiss hoped he had his man in the house off Washington Circle, but on the very night he had seen him, Jenny claimed that Sullivan had tried to enter the Laurels. Then, suppose we found Sullivan and proved the satchel and its contents his. Since the police had the bit of chain, it might mean involving Allison in the story. I sat down and buried my face in my hands. There was no escape. I figured it out despondingly. Against me was the evidence of the survivors of the Ontario that I had been accused of the murder at the time. There had been bloodstains on my pillow and a hidden dagger. Into the bargain, in my possession, had been found a traveling bag containing the dead man's pocketbook. In my favor was McKnight's theory against Mrs. Conway. She had a motive for wishing to secure the notes, she believed I was in Lower 10, and she had collapsed at the discovery of the crime in the morning. Against both of these theories, I accuse a purely chimerical person named Sullivan, who was not seen by any of the survivors, save one, Allison, whom I could not bring into the case. I could find a motive for his murdering his father-in-law, whom he hated. But again, I would have to drag in the girl, and not one of the theories explained the telegram and the broken necklace. Outside the office force was arriving. They were comfortably ignorant of my presence, and over the transom floated scraps of dialogue and the stenographer's gurgling laugh. McKnight had a relative who was reading law with him in the intervals between calling up the young women of his acquaintance. He came in singing, and the office boy joined in with the uncertainty of voice of 15. I smiled grimly. I was too busy with my own troubles to find any joy in opening the door and startling them into silence. I even heard, without resentment, blobs of the uncertain voice inquire when Blake would be back. I hoped McKnight would arrive before the arrest occurred. There were many things to arrange, but when at last, impatient of his delay, I telephoned, I found he had been gone for more than an hour. Clearly, he was not coming directly to the office, and with such resignation as I could muster, I paced the floor and waited. I felt more alone than I have ever felt in my life. Born an orphan, as Ritchie said, I had made my own way, carved out myself such success as had been mine. I had built up my house of life on the props of law and order, and now some unknown hand had withdrawn the supports, and I stood among ruins. And I suppose it is the maternal in a woman that makes a man turn to her when everything else fails. The eternal boy in him goes to have his wounded pride bandaged, his tattered self-respect repaired. If he loves the woman, he wants her to kiss the hurt. The longing to see Alison, always with me, was stronger than I was that morning. It might be that I would not see her again. I had nothing to say to her save one thing, and that, under the cloud that hung over me, I did not dare to say. But I wanted to see her, to touch her hand, as only a lonely man can crave it. I wanted the comfort of her, the peace that lay in her presence. And so, with every step outside the door a threat, I telephoned to her. She was gone. The disappointment was great, for my need was great. In a fury of revolt against the scheme of things, I heard that she had started home to Richmond, but that she might still be caught at the station. To see her had by that time become an obsession. I picked up my hat, threw open the door, and oblivious of the shock to the office force of my presence, followed so immediately by my exit, I dashed out to the elevator. As I went down in one cage, I caught a glimpse of Johnson and two other men going up in the next. I hardly gave them a thought. There was no hansom in sight, and I jumped on a passing car. Let come what might, arrest, prison, disgrace, I was going to see Alison. I saw her. I flung into the station, saw that it was empty, for she was not there. Then I hurried back to the gates. She was there, a familiar figure in blue, the very gown in which I always thought of her, the one she had worn when, heaven help me, I had kissed her, at the Carter farm. And she was not alone. Bending over her, talking earnestly with all his boyish heart in his face, was Richie. They did not see me, and I was glad of it. After all, it had been McKnight's game first. I turned on my heel and made my way blindly out of the station. Before I lost them, I turned once and looked toward them, standing apart from the crowd, absorbed in each other. They were the only two people on earth that I cared about, and I left them there together. Then I went back miserably to the office and awaited arrest. Chapter 26. On to Richmond. Strangely enough, I was not disturbed that day. McKnight did not appear at all. I sat at my desk and transacted routine business all afternoon, working with feverish energy. Like a man on the verge of a critical illness or a hazardous journey, I cleared up my correspondence, paid bills until I had writer's cramp from signing checks, read over my will, and paid up my life insurance, made to the benefit of an elderly sister of my mother's. I no longer dreaded arrest. After that morning in the station, I felt that anything would be a relief from the tension. I went home with perfect openness, courting the warrant that I knew was waiting, but I was not molested. The delay puzzled me. The early part of the evening was uneventful. I read until late, with occasional lapses, when my book lay at my elbow and I smoked and thought. Mrs. Clopton closed the house with ostentatious caution about 11 and hung around waiting to enlarge on the outrageousness of the police search. I did not encourage her. One would think, she concluded pompously, one foot in the hall, that you were something you oughtn't to be, Mr. Lawrence. They acted as though you had committed a crime. I'm not sure that I didn't, Mrs. Clopton, I said wearily. Somebody did. The general verdict seems to point my way. She stared at me in speechless indignation. Then she flounced out. She came back once to say that the paper predicted cooler weather and that she had put a blanket on my bed, but to her disappointment, I refused to reopen the subject. At 11:30, McKnight and Hotchkiss came in. Richie has a habit of stopping his car in front of the house and honking until someone comes out. He has a code of signals with the horn, which I never remember. Too long and a short blast mean, I believe, send out a box of cigarettes. And 6 short blasts, which sound like a police call, mean, can you lend me some money? Tonight I knew something was up, for he got out and rang the doorbell like a Christian. They came into the library, and Hotchkiss wiped his collar until it gleamed. McKnight was aggressively cheerful. "Not pinched yet," he exclaimed. "What do you think of that for luck? You always were a fortunate devil, Lawrence." "Yes, I assented with some bitterness. I hardly know how to contain myself for joy sometimes. I suppose you know, to Hotchkiss, that the police were here while we were at Cresson, and that they found the bag that I brought from the wreck. Things are coming to a head, he said thoughtfully, unless a little plan that I have in mind. He hesitated. I hope so. I am pretty nearly desperate, I said doggedly. I've got a mental toothache, and the sooner it's pulled the better. Tut, tut, said McKnight. Think of the disgrace to the firm if its senior member goes up for life, or... He twisted his handkerchief into a noose and went through an elaborate pantomime. Although jail isn't so bad anyhow, he finished. There are fellows that get the habit and keep going back and going back. He looked at his watch, and I fancied his cheerfulness was strained. Hotchkiss was nervously fumbling my book. Did you ever read The Purloined Letter, Mr. Blakely? He inquired. Probably. Years ago, I said. Poe, isn't it? He was choked at my indifference. It is a masterpiece, he said, with enthusiasm. I reread it today. And what happened? Then I inspected the rooms in the house off Washington Circle. I made some discoveries, Mr. Blakely. For one thing, our man there is left-handed. He looked around for our approval. There was a small cushion on the dresser, and the scarf pins in it had been stuck in with the left hand. Somebody may have twisted the cushion, I objected, but he looked hurt, and I desisted. There is only one discrepancy, he admitted, but it troubles me. According to Mrs. Carter, at the farmhouse, our man wore gaudy pajamas, while I found here only the most severely plain nightshirts. Any buttons off? McKnight inquired, looking again at his watch. The buttons were there, the amateur detective answered gravely, but the buttonhole next the top one was torn through. McKnight winked at me furtively. I am convinced of one thing, Hotchkiss went on, clearing his throat. The papers are not in that room. Either he carries them with him, or he has sold them. A sound on the street made both my visitors listen sharply. Whatever it was, it passed on, however. I was growing curious, and the restraint was telling on McKnight. He has no talent for secrecy. In the interval, we discussed the strange occurrence at Cresson, which lost nothing by Hotchkiss's dry narration. And so, he concluded, the woman in the Baltimore hospital is the wife of Henry Sullivan and the daughter of the man he murdered. No wonder he collapsed when he heard of the wreck. Joy, probably, McKnight put in. Is that clock right, Lawrence? Never mind, it doesn't matter. By the way, Mrs. Conway dropped in the office yesterday while you were away. What? I sprang from my chair. Sure thing. Said she had heard great things of us and wanted us to handle her case against the railroad. I would like to know what she's driving at, I reflected. Is she trying to reach me through you? Richie's flippancy is often a cloak for deeper feeling. He dropped it now. Yes, he said. She's after the notes, of course, and I'll tell you I felt like a poltroon, whatever that may be, when I turned her down. She stood by the door with her face white and told me contemptuously that I could save you from a murder charge and wouldn't do it. She made me feel like a cur. I was just as guilty as if I could have obliged her. She hinted that there were reasons, and she laid my attitude to beastly motives. Nonsense, I said, as easily as I could. Hotchkiss had gone to the window. She was excited. There are no reasons, whatever she means. Richie put his hand on my shoulder. We've been together too long to let any reasons or unreasons come between us, old man, he said, not very steadily. Hotchkiss, who had been silent, here came forward in his most impressive manner. He put his hands under his coat-tails and coughed. Mr. Blakely, he began, by Mr. McKnight's advice, we have arranged a little interview here tonight. If all has gone as I planned, Mr. Henry Pinckney Sullivan is by this time under arrest. Within a very few minutes, he will be here. I wanted to talk to him before he was locked up, Richie explained. He's clever enough to be worth knowing, and besides, I'm not so cocksure of his guilt as our friend the patch on the seat of government. No murderer worthy of the name needs 6 different motives for the same crime, beginning with robbery and ending with an unpleasant father-in-law. We were all silent for a while. McKnight stationed himself at a window, and Hotchkiss paced the floor expectantly. "It's a great day for modern detective methods," he chirruped. "While the police have been guarding houses and standing with their mouths open, waiting for clues to fall in and choke them, we have pieced together, bit by bit, a fabric." The doorbell rang, followed immediately by sounds of footsteps in the hall. McKnight threw the door open, and Hotchkiss, raised on his toes, flung out his arm in a gesture of superb eloquence. "Behold, your man," he declaimed. Through the open doorway came a tall, blond fellow, clad in light grey, wearing tan shoes, and followed closely by an officer. "I brought him here as you suggested, Mr. McKnight," said the constable. But McKnight was doubled over the library table in silent convulsions of mirth, and I was almost as bad. Little Hotchkiss stood up, his important attitude finally changing to one of chagrin, while the blond man ceased to look angry and became sheepish. It was Stuart, our confidential clerk for the last half-dozen years. McKnight sat up and wiped his eyes. "Stuart," he said sternly, "there are 2 very serious things we have learned about you. First, you jab your scarf pins into your cushion with your left hand, which is most reprehensible. Second, you wear, nightshirts instead of pajamas. Worse than that, perhaps, we find that one of them has a buttonhole torn out at the neck." Stuart was bewildered. He looked from McKnight to me, and then at the crestfallen Hotchkiss. "I haven't any idea what it's all about," he said. "I was arrested as I reached my boarding house tonight after the theater and brought directly here. I told the officer it was a mistake." Poor Hotchkiss tried bravely to justify the fiasco. "You cannot deny," he contended, "that Mr. Andrew Bronson followed you to your rooms last Monday evening." Stuart looked at us and flushed. "No, I don't deny it," he said, "but there was nothing criminal about it, on my part at least. Mr. Bronson has been trying to induce me to secure the forged notes for him, but I did not even know where they were." "And you were not on the wrecked Washington flyer?" persisted Hotchkiss. But McKnight interfered. "There is no use trying to put the other man's identity on Stuart, Mr. Hotchkiss," he protested. "He has been our confidential clerk for 6 years, and has not been away from the office a day for a year. I'm afraid that the beautiful fabric we have pieced out of all these scraps is going to be a crazy quilt." His tone was facetious, but I could detect the undercurrent of real disappointment. I paid the constable for his trouble, and he departed. Stuart, still indignant, left to go back to Washington Circle. He shook hands with McKnight and myself magnanimously, but he hurled a look of utter hatred at Hotchkiss, sunk crestfallen in his chair. "As far as I can see," said McKnight dryly, "we're exactly as far along as we were the day we met at the Carter place. We're not a step nearer to finding our man." "We have one thing that may be of value," I suggested. "He is the husband of a bronze-haired woman at Van Kirk's hospital, and it is just possible we may trace him through her." "I hope we are not going to lose your valuable cooperation, Mr. Hotchkiss?" I asked. He roused at that to feeble interest. Oh, of course not, if you still care to have me. I was wondering about the man who just went out, Stuart, you say? I told his landlady tonight that he wouldn't need the room again. I hope she hasn't rented it to somebody else." We cheered him as best we could, and I suggested that we go to Baltimore the next day and try to find the real Sullivan through his wife. He left sometime after midnight, and Richie and I were alone. He drew a chair near the lamp and lighted a cigarette, and for a time we were silent. I was in the shadow, and I sat back and watched him. It was not surprising, I thought, that she cared for him. Women had always loved him, perhaps because he always loved them. There was no disloyalty in the thought. It was the lad's nature to give and crave affection. Only I was different. I had never really cared about a girl before, and my life had been singularly loveless. I had fought a lonely battle always. Once before, in college, we had both laid ourselves and our callow devotions at the feet of the same girl. Her name was Dorothy. I had forgotten the rest, but I remembered the sequel. In a spirit of quixotic youth, I had relinquished my claim in favor of Richie and had gone cheerfully on my way, elevated by my heroic sacrifice to a somber, white-hot martyrdom. As is often the case, McKnight's first words showed our parallel lines of thought. "I say, Lolly," he asked, "do you remember Dorothy Brown?" Brown, that was it. "Dorothy Brown," I repeated. "Oh, why, yes, I recall her now. Why?" "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking about her. That's all. You remember you were crazy about her and dropped back because she preferred me." "I got out," I said with dignity, "because you declared you would shoot yourself if she didn't go with you to something or other." "Oh, why, yes, I recall now," he mimicked. He tossed his cigarette in the general direction of the hearth and got up. We were both a little conscious, and he stood with his back to me, fingering a Japanese vase on the mantel. "I was thinking," he began, turning the vase around, "that if you feel pretty well again and ready to take hold, that I should like to go away for a week or so. Things are fairly well cleaned up at the office." "Do you mean you are going to Richmond?" I asked, after a scarcely perceptible pause. He turned and faced me with his hands thrust in his pockets. "No, that's off, Lolly. The Syberts are going for a week's cruise along the coast. The hot weather has played hob with me, and the cruise means 7 days breeze and bridge." I lighted a cigarette and offered him the box, but he refused. He was looking haggard and suddenly tired. I could not think of anything to say. And neither could he, evidently. The matter between us lay too deep for speech. "How's Canada?" he asked. "Martin says a month, and she will be all right," I returned in the same tone. He picked up his hat, but he had something more to say. He blurted it out, finally, halfway to the door. "The Syberts are not going for a couple of days," he said, "and if you want a day or so off to go down to Richmond yourself—" "Perhaps I shall," I returned as indifferently as I could. "Not going yet, are you?" "Yes. It is late." He drew in his breath as if he had something more to say, but the impulse passed. "Well, good night," he said from the doorway. "Good night, old man." The next moment the outer door slammed, and I heard the engine of the cannonball throbbing in the street. Then the quiet settled down around me again, and there in the lamplight I dreamed dreams. I was going to see her. Suddenly the idea of being shut away, even temporarily, from so great and wonderful a world became intolerable. The possibility of arrest before I could get to Richmond was hideous, the night without end. I made my escape the next morning through the stable back of the house, and then, by devious dark and winding ways, to the office. There, after a conference with Blobbs, whose features fairly jerked with excitement, I double-locked the door of my private office and finished off some imperative work. By 10 o'clock, I was free, and for the 20th time I consulted my train schedule. At 5 minutes after 10, with McKnight not yet in sight, Blobbs knocked at the door, the double rap we had agreed upon, and on being admitted, slipped in and quietly closed the door behind him. His eyes were glistening with excitement, and a purple dab of typewriter ink gave him a peculiarly villainous and stealthy expression. "They're here," he said, "2 of them, and that crazy Stewart wasn't on, and said you were somewhere in the building." A door slammed outside, followed by steps on the uncarpeted outer office. "This way," said Blobbs in a husky undertone, and darting into a lavatory, threw open a door that I had always supposed locked. Thence into a back hall piled high with boxes, and past the presses of a bookbindery to the freight elevator. Greatly to Blobbs' disappointment, there was no pursuit. I was exhilarated but out of breath when we emerged into an alleyway, and the sharp daylight shone on Blob's excited face. "Great sport, isn't it?" I panted, dropping $1 into his palm, inked to correspond with his face. "Regular walk away in the 100-yard dash." "Give me $2 more, and I'll drop 'em down the elevator shaft," he suggested ferociously. I left him there with his bloodthirsty schemes and started for the station. I had a tendency to look behind me now and then, but I reached the station unnoticed. The afternoon was hot. The train rolled slowly along, stopping to pant at sweltering stations, from whose roofs the heat rose in waves. But I noticed these things objectively, not subjectively, for at the end of the journey was a girl with blue eyes and dark brown hair that could, had I not seen it, hang loose in bewitching tangles or be twisted into little coils of delight. Chapter 27. The Sea, the Sand, the Stars. I telephoned as soon as I reached my hotel, and I had not known how much I had hoped from seeing her until I learned that she was out of town. I hung up the receiver, almost dizzy with disappointment, and it was fully 5 minutes before I thought of calling up again and asking if she was within telephone reach. It seemed she was down on the bay, staying with the Samuel Forbeses. Sammy Forbes. It was a name to conjure with just then. In the old days at college, I had rather flouted him, but now I was ready to take him to my heart. I remembered that he had always meant well, anyhow, and that he was explosively generous. I called him up. "By the fumes of gasoline," he said, when I told him who I was. "Blakely, the fount of wisdom against woman. Blakely, the great unkissed. Welcome to our city." Whereupon he proceeded to urge me to come down to the shack and to say that I was an agreeable surprise, because 4 times in 2 hours youths had called up to ask if Alison West was stopping with him and to suggest that they had a vacant day or two. "Oh, Miss West," I shouted politely. There was a buzzing on the line. "Is she there?" Sam had no suspicions. Was not I in his mind always the great unkissed, which sounds like the great unwashed and is even more of a reproach? He asked me down promptly as I had hoped and thrust aside my objections. "Nonsense," he said. "Bring yourself. The lady that keeps my boarding house is calling to me to insist. You remember Dorothy, don't you, Dorothy Brown? She says, unless you have lost your figure, you can wear my clothes all right. All you need here is a bathing suit for daytime and a dinner coat for evening." "It sounds cool," I temporized. "If you are sure I won't put you out, very well, Sam, since you and your wife are good enough. I have a couple of days free. Give my love to Dorothy until I can do it myself." Sam met me himself and drove me out to the shack, which proved to be a substantial house overlooking the water. On the way, he confided to me that lots of married men thought they were contented when they were merely resigned, but that it was the only life, and that Sam, Jr., could swim like a duck. Incidentally, he said that Alison was his wife's cousin, their respective grandmothers having, at proper intervals, married the same man, and that Alison would lose her good looks if she was not careful. "I say she's worried, and I stick to it," he said, as he threw the lines to a groom and prepared to get out. "You know her, and she's the kind of girl you think you can read like a book. But you can't. Don't fool yourself. Take a good look at her at dinner, Blake. You won't lose your head like the other fellows, and then tell me what's wrong with her. We're mighty fond of Allie." He went ponderously up the steps, for Sam had put on weight since I knew him. At the door, he turned around. "Do you happen to know the McClures at Seal Harbor?" he asked irrelevantly. But Mrs. Sam came into the hall just then, both hands out to greet me, and, whatever Forbes had meant to say, he did not pick up the subject again. "We are having tea in here," Dorothy said gaily, indicating the door behind her. "Tea by courtesy, because I think tea is the only beverage that isn't represented. And then we must dress, for this is hop night at the club." "Which is as great a misnomer as the tea," Sam put in, ponderously struggling out of his linen driving coat. It's bridge night, and the only hops are in the beer." He was still gurgling over this as he took me upstairs. He showed me my room himself, and then began the fruitless search for evening raiment that kept me home that night from the club, for I couldn't wear Sam's clothes. That was clear after a perspiring séance of a half hour. "I won't do it, Sam," I said, when I had draped his dress coat on me toga fashion. "Who am I to have clothing to spare like this, when many a poor chap hasn't even a cellar door to cover him? I won't do it. I'm selfish, but not that selfish." "Lord," he said, wiping his face, "how you've kept your figure. I can't wear a belt anymore. Got to have suspenders." He reflected over his grievance for some time, sitting on the side of the bed. "You could go as you are," he said finally. "We do it all the time, only tonight happens to be the annual something or other, and—" He trailed off into silence, trying to buckle my belt around him. "A good 6 inches," he sighed. "I never get into a hansom cab, any more than I don't expect to see the horse fly up into the air. Well, Allie isn't going either. She turned down Granger this afternoon, the Annapolis fellow you met on the stairs, pigeon-breasted chap, and she always gets a headache on those occasions." He got up heavily and went to the door. "Granger is leaving," he said. "I may be able to get his dinner coat for you." "How well do you know her?" he asked, with his hand on the knob. "If you mean Dolly—" "Allison." "Fairly well," I said cautiously. "Not as well as I would like to. I dined with her last week in Washington, and I knew her before that." Forbes touched the bell instead of going out, and told the servant who answered to see if Mr. Granger's suitcase had gone. If not, to bring it across the hall. Then he came back to his former position on the bed. "You see, we feel responsible for Allie, near relation and all that," he began pompously. "And we can't talk to the people here at the house. All the men are in love with her, and all the women are jealous. Then there's a lot of money too, or will be." "Confound the money," I muttered. "That is, nothing." Razor slipped. "I can tell you," he went on, "because you don't lose your head over every pretty face, although Allie is more than that, of course. But about a month ago she went away, to Seal Harbor, to visit Janet McClure. Know her? She came home to Richmond yesterday and then came down here. Allie, I mean. And yesterday afternoon, Dolly had a letter from Janet, something about a second man, and saying she was disappointed not to have had Allison there, that she had promised them a 2 weeks visit. What do you make of that? And that isn't the worst." Allie herself wasn't in the room, but there were 8 other women, and because Dolly had put belladonna in her eyes the night before to see how she would look, and as a result couldn't see anything nearer than across the room, someone read the letter aloud to her, and the whole story is out. One of the cats told Granger, and the boy proposed to Allie today to show her he didn't care a tinker's damn where she had been. "Good boy," I said with enthusiasm. I liked the Granger fellow, since he was out of the running. But Sam was looking at me with suspicion. "Blake," he said, "if I didn't know you for what you are, I'd say you were interested there yourself." Being so near her, under the same roof, with even the tie of a dubious secret between us, was making me heady. I pushed Forbes toward the door. "I interested," I retorted, holding him by the shoulders. "There isn't a word in your vocabulary to fit my condition. I am an island in a sunlit sea of emotion, Sam. An empty place surrounded by longing. An empty place surrounded by longing," he retorted. "You want your dinner? That's what's the matter with you." I shut the door on him then. He seemed suddenly sordid. Dinner, I thought, although as a matter of fact I made a very fair meal when, Granger's suitcase not having gone, in his coat and some other man's trousers, I was finally fit for the amenities. Allison did not come down to dinner, so it was clear she would not go over to the clubhouse dance. I pled my injured arm and a fictitious, vaguely located sprain from the wreck as an excuse for remaining at home. Sam regaled the table with accounts of my distrust of women, my one love affair with Dorothy, to which I responded, as was expected, that only my failure there had kept me single all these years, and that if Sam should be mysteriously missing during the bathing hour tomorrow, and so on. And when the endless meal was over, and yards of white veils had been tied over pounds of hair, or is it two bought by the yard, and some 8 ensembles with their abject compliments had been packed into 3 automobiles and a trap, I drew a long breath and faced about. I had just then only one object in life: to find Allison, to assure her of my absolute faith and confidence in her, and to offer my help and my poor self, if she would let me, in her service. She was not easy to find. I searched the lower floor, the verandas and the grounds, circumspectly. Then I ran into a little English girl who turned out to be her maid, and who also was searching. She was concerned because her mistress had had no dinner, and because the tray of food she carried would soon be cold. I took the tray from her on the glimpse of something white on the shore, and that was how I met the girl again. She was sitting on an overturned boat, her chin in her hands, staring out to sea. The soft tide of the bay lapped almost at her feet, and the draperies of her white gown melted hazily into the sands. She looked like a wraith, a despondent phantom of the sea, although the adjective is redundant. Nobody ever thinks of a cheerful phantom. Strangely enough, considering her evident sadness, she was whistling softly to herself, over and over some dreary little minor air that sounded like a bohemian dirge. She glanced up quickly when I made a misstep and my dishes jingled. All considered, the tray was out of the picture. The sea, the misty starlight, the girl with her beauty, even the sad little whistle that stopped now and then to go bravely on again, as though it fought against the odds of a trembling lip. And then I came, accompanied by a tray of little silver dishes that jingled and an unmistakable odor of broiled chicken. "Oh," she said quickly, and then, "Oh, I thought you were Jenkins." "Timeo Danaus. What's the rest of it?" I asked, tendering my offering. "You didn't have any dinner, you know." I sat down beside her. "See, I'll be the table. What was the old fairy tale? Little goat bleat, little table appear." I'm perfectly willing to be the goat too. She was laughing rather tremulously. "We never do meet like other people, do we?" she asked. "We really ought to shake hands and say, 'How are you?'" "Nah, I don't want to meet you like other people, and I suppose you always think of me as wearing the other fellow's clothes," I returned meekly. "I'm doing it again. I don't seem to be able to help it. These are Granger's that I have on now." She threw back her head and laughed again, joyously this time. "Oh, it's so ridiculous," she said, "and you have never seen me when I was not eating. It's too prosaic." "Which reminds me that the chicken is getting cold, and the ice warm," I suggested. At the time, I thought there could be no place better than the farmhouse kitchen, but this is. I ordered all this for something I want to say to you: the sea, the sand, the stars. "How alliterative you are," she said, trying to be flippant. "You are not to say anything until I have had my supper. Look how the things are spilled around." But she ate nothing after all, and pretty soon I put the tray down in the sand. I said little. There was no hurry. We were together, and time meant nothing against that age-long wash of the sea. The air blew her hair in small damp curls against her face, and little by little the tide retreated, leaving our boat an oasis in a waste of grey sand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year. "Do you suppose," the walrus said, "that they could get it clear?" And she threw at me once when she must have known I was going to speak. I held her hand, and as long as I merely held it, she let it lie warm in mine. But when I raised it to my lips and kissed the soft, open palm, she drew it away without displeasure. "Not that, please," she protested, and fell to whistling softly again, her chin in her hands. "I can't sing," she said, to break an awkward pause, and so, when I'm fidgety or have something on my mind, I whistle. I hope you don't dislike it." "I love it," I asserted warmly. I did. When she pursed her lips like that, I was mad to kiss them. "I saw you at the station," she said suddenly. You were in a hurry to go." I did not say anything, and after a pause, she drew a long breath. "Men are queer, aren't they?" she said, and fell to whistling again. After a while, she sat up as if she had made a resolution. "I'm going to confess something," she announced suddenly. "You said, that you had ordered all this for something you wanted to say to me. But the fact is, I fixed it all. Came here, I mean, because I knew you would come, and I had something to tell you. It was such a miserable thing, I needed the accessories to help me out." "I don't want to hear anything that distresses you to tell," I assured her. "I didn't come here to force your confidence, Allison. I came because I couldn't help it." She did not object to my use of her name. "Have you found your papers?" she asked, looking directly at me for almost the first time. "Not yet. We hope to." "The police have not interfered with you?" "They haven't had any opportunity," I equivocated. "You needn't distress yourself about that anyhow." "But I do. I wonder why you still believe in me. Nobody else does." "I wonder," I repeated, "why I do. If you produce Harry Sullivan," she was saying, partly to herself, "and if you could connect him with Mr. Bronson and get a full account of why he was on the train and all that, it would help, wouldn't it?" I acknowledged that it would. Now that the whole truth was almost in my possession, I was stricken with the old cowardice. I did not want to know what she might tell me. The yellow line on the horizon, where the moon was coming up, was a broken bit of golden chain. My heel in the sand was again pressed on a woman's yielding fingers. I pulled myself together with a jerk. "In order that what you might tell me may help me if it will," I said constrainedly, "it would be necessary, perhaps, that you tell it to the police. Since they have found the end of the necklace—" "The end of the necklace," she repeated slowly. "What about the end of the necklace?" I stared at her. "Don't you remember," I leaned forward, "the end of the cameo necklace, the part that was broken off, and was found in the black sealskin bag stained with blood?" "Blood," she said dully. "You mean that you found the broken end? And then you had my gold pocketbook, and you saw the necklace in it, and you must have thought—" "I didn't think anything," I hastened to assure her. "I tell you, Allison, I never thought of anything but that you were unhappy and that I had no right to help you. God knows, I thought you didn't want me to help you." She held out her hand to me, and I took it between both of mine. No word of love had passed between us, but I felt that she knew and understood. It was one of the moments that come seldom in a lifetime, and then only in great crises, a moment of perfect understanding and trust. Then she drew her hand away and sat erect and determined, her fingers laced in her lap. As she talked, the moon came up slowly and threw its bright pathway across the water. Back of us, in the trees beyond the sea wall, a sleepy bird chirruped drowsily, and a wave, larger and bolder than its brothers, sped up the sand, bringing the moon's silver to our very feet. I bent toward the girl. "I'm going to ask just one question. Anything you like." Her voice was almost dreary. "Was it because of anything you are going to tell me that you refused Richie?" She drew her breath in sharply. "No," she said, without looking at me. "No, that was not the reason."